At 2 a.m., Maxwell Frost found a single line buried in the federal budget, one that erased oversight on silencers. Days later, he cornered Reppers Bob Good with the question no one wanted asked. Who paid you to silence America? He laid 12 names on the table. What happened next? Congress will never forget. Stay through to the end. Frost doesn't just expose the money. He makes them look the victims in the eye. The fluorescent lights of the House Budget Committee room cast harsh shadows across stacks of paper that towered like tombstones on the mahogany table. It was 2:17 a.m. and the air hung thick with the stale breath of exhausted legislators and the bitter residue of too much coffee. Most members had long since retreated to their offices or hotel rooms, leaving behind a skeleton crew to rubber stamp what everyone assumed was routine budgetary language. Maxwell Frost rubbed his eyes, the youngest member of Congress, fighting sleep as he methodically turned through pages of dense legislative text. At 26, he still carried the urgency of an activist, the same restless energy that had driven him to organize against gun violence before he ever set foot in these marble halls. While his colleagues saw budget meetings as necessary drudgery, Frost treated each line item as a potential battleground for American lives. His finger traced down section 4.7.2, subsection C, when the words stopped him cold. Federal restrictions on sound suppression devices manufactured or sold after January 1st, 2024 shall be deemed null and void pending review by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Frost's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Sound suppression devices. Silencers. Someone had buried the deregulation of silencers in a budget bill hidden between highway funding and agricultural subsidies like a knife wrapped in silk. He flipped back through the previous drafts scattered across his desk. Nothing. The clause wasn't in yesterday's version, wasn't in last week's markup. Someone had slipped it in during the final hours when the only people awake were those desperate to get home to their families. Jesus Christ, he whispered to the empty room. The sound of his voice seemed to echo off the portraits of former committee chairs, their painted eyes now seeming to watch with the judgment of history. Frost grabbed his phone and began photographing the pages, his hand steady despite the tremor of rage building in his chest. Across the hall, Repper Bob Good was packing his briefcase with the methodical precision of a man who had just completed a successful mission. The Virginia Republican whistled softly under his breath, an old hymn his mother used to sing as he tucked away folders marked Budget Reconciliation Final. His thick fingers drummed against the leather handle as he walked toward the elevators, his heavy footsteps echoing in the deserted corridor. He didn't notice Maxwell Frost watching from the committee room doorway, the young Democrat's silhouette framed by harsh fluorescent light like a specter of accountability. 3 days later, Frost sat in his cramped congressional office surrounded by the detritus of investigation, printed emails, highlighted budget documents, and a growing conspiracy board that would have made any FBI field office proud. His chief of staff, Maria Santos, paced behind him like a caged jaguar, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in staccato bursts of nervous energy. "Tell me again why we're doing this," Maria said, gesturing at the wall of documents. "Budget reconciliation happens fast. Maybe it was just..." Just what? Frost spun in his chair to face her. Just accidentally removing federal oversight on devices specifically designed to mask the sound of gunfire, just coincidentally benefiting manufacturers who've been lobbying for this exact change for 3 years. Maria held up her hands in surrender. I'm playing devil's advocate here, Max. You know how this works. You start making accusations about backroom deals and hidden agendas, they'll paint you as a conspiracy theorist. Frost turned back to his computer screen where he'd been tracking the legislative history of the silencer clause. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, each click revealing another layer of the maze he was determined to navigate. Look at this, he said, pointing to a document that glowed on his monitor. The final markup session ended at 11:30 p.m. Tuesday. The clause appears in the version distributed at 1:45 a.m. Wednesday, 95 minutes. Someone had exactly 95 minutes to slip this in before the committee vote. Maria leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the screen. The timeline was laid out in clinical detail, 11:30 p.m. Final markup concludes, 12:15 a.m. Committee staff begins final document preparation. 1:45 a.m. Final version distributed to members. 2:00 a.m. Vote called. Who had access during that window? She asked. Frost pulled up another document, the official sign-in log for the committee room during those crucial hours. 5 names, 4 Democratic staffers working on technical corrections, and 1 Republican member who had stayed behind ostensibly to review agricultural provisions. Robert Bob Good, Virginia's 5th District. Son of a bitch, Maria breathed. Frost's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact he'd cultivated during his activist days, someone who worked in the shadows between K Street and Capitol Hill, trading information like currency in the underground economy of Washington influence. You're asking about silencers. Check Good's office. Lobby meeting Tuesday 8 p.m. NRA affiliate. Have documents. That evening, Frost met his source in the parking garage of a downtown hotel, the kind of place where lobbyists took clients they couldn't be seen with in public. The concrete walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a dead acoustic space that made every whisper feel like a shout. The source was a slight woman in her 40s, someone whose unremarkable appearance was her greatest professional asset. She handed Frost a manila envelope without ceremony. Tuesday night, she said. Good met with representatives from the Firearms Freedom Institute. They're a shell organization. Real money comes from 3 major manufacturers, Sig Sauer Silencer Co. and Dead Air Armament. Frost opened the envelope, revealing photocopies of correspondence on official house letterhead. The top document was a draft email from Good's office to the Budget Committee chair suggesting technical corrections to the reconciliation bill. The suggested language was identical to what had appeared in the final version. How did you? Frost began. Questions kill sources. The woman interrupted. What you do with this is your business. But those companies have been pushing for silencer deregulation since 2019, 3 weeks after Virginia Beach. The words hit Frost like a physical blow. Virginia Beach. 12 people murdered by a man using a .45 caliber pistol equipped with a suppressor. The killer had walked through city offices like a ghost, his weapon barely audible above the hum of air conditioning and office chatter. Victims had died without warning, without the chance to run or hide that comes with the crack of gunfire. He's taking money to make it easier for killers to kill silently. Frost said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman was already walking away, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls like the ticking of a countdown clock. The House Ethics Committee hearing room buzzed with the electricity of blood in the water. Frost had managed to force a formal inquiry into the budget process, not quite the criminal investigation he wanted, but a public forum where questions could be asked and answers demanded under oath. Bob Good sat at the witness table, his bulk filling the chair like a mountain of righteous indignation. He wore his best suit navy blue with a flag pin on the lapel and maintained the expression of a man whose integrity had never been questioned by anyone whose opinion mattered. Behind him, 3 rows of observers, journalists, lobbyists, and the kind of political tourists who fed on Washington drama like parasites on a host. In the front row, Frost noticed several men in expensive suits whose faces he recognized from firearms industry conferences. Committee Chairman Repcher Susan Davis called the hearing to order with a gavel that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The formal language of congressional procedure filled the air, a ritual as old as democracy itself, designed to create the illusion that truth could be extracted through proper adherence to rules. The committee will examine allegations regarding the legislative process surrounding the Budget Reconciliation Act of 2024, Davis intoned. Specifically claims that certain provisions were inserted without proper deliberation or transparency. Good leaned forward to his microphone with practiced ease. Madam Chairman, I welcome this opportunity to clear the air. The insinuations made by the gentleman from Florida are not only false, but represent a dangerous attack on the legislative process itself. Frost felt his jaw clench. Good's voice carried the honey-thick accent of rural Virginia, the kind of drawl that suggested front porches and sweet tea and values that city folk couldn't understand. It was political theater, designed to make him seem like an outside agitator attacking a hometown hero. Mr. Good, Frost began when recognized, you remained in the Budget Committee room until approximately 12:30 a.m. on the night in question. Can you explain what you were doing during that time? Reviewing agricultural provisions, as is my responsibility to the farmers of Virginia's 5th District, Good replied smoothly. I take my duties seriously, unlike some members who prefer grandstanding to governance. The insult landed exactly as intended, drawing a few chuckles from the gallery, but Frost had expected this. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it with theatrical precision. Mr. Good, are you familiar with the Firearms Freedom Institute? One action! For just a moment, no more than a heartbeat, Good's composure cracked. His eyes flicked toward the gallery, toward the men in expensive suits before returning to Frost with renewed steel. I meet with many organizations representing the interests of my constituents. On Tuesday, October 15th, did you meet with representatives of the Firearms Freedom Institute in your office? I meet with many. Yes or no, Mr. Good? Did you meet with them on October 15th? The silence stretched like a taut wire. Good's lawyer, seated behind him, leaned forward to whisper something in his ear. Good nodded almost imperceptibly. I may have had a brief meeting with concerned citizens about regulatory overreach. Frost felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with cornering a target. He pulled out the first document, a photocopy of Good's calendar showing the 8 p.m. appointment. A 2-hour meeting with lobbyists representing silencer manufacturers qualifies as brief in your estimation. I object to the characterization. Mr. Good, these are your own calendar entries. Frost held up the paper so the cameras could capture it. October 15th, 8 dur to 10:15 p.m. FFI strategy session. The room erupted in murmurs. Frost could see journalists frantically typing on their phones, live tweeting the revelation. In the gallery, the men in expensive suits no longer looked comfortable. But Good was a veteran of political warfare. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had survived worse storms. Congressman Frost, your theatrical displays don't change the fundamental facts. I believe in the Second Amendment. I believe in reducing unnecessary government regulation. If that makes me guilty of something in your estimation, then I plead guilty to standing up for constitutional rights. The response was perfect political jujitsu, turning Frost's attack into an affirmation of conservative values. But Frost had been expecting this too. He reached into his folder and pulled out the second document. Mr. Good, did the Firearms Freedom Institute provide you with specific legislative language during that meeting? I don't recall the specific details. Let me refresh your memory. Frost held up a photocopy of the draft email. This is correspondence from your office sent at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, less than 2 hours after your meeting ended. It contains suggested language for technical corrections to the budget bill. Good's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Congressional offices regularly suggest technical corrections. That's part of our job. Technical corrections. Frost's voice rose, carrying clearly through the committee room's sound system. Mr. Good, this language removes federal oversight from devices specifically designed to suppress the sound of gunfire. How is that a technical correction? Sound suppressors have legitimate sporting and hunting applications. Mr. Good, are you familiar with the Virginia Beach shooting of May 31st, 2019? The question landed like a physical blow. Good's mouth opened, then closed. In the gallery, Frost could see families of gun violence victims leaning forward in their seats. He had invited them specifically for this moment. Of course it was a tragedy. 12 people murdered by a gunman using a .45 caliber pistol equipped with a suppressor. Frost's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the room to lean in to hear him. The victims never heard the shots that killed them. They died in silence. Frost reached into his folder one more time and pulled out 12 sheets of paper, one for each victim. Photos and brief biographies he had prepared with their family's permission. He began laying them out on the table one by one, each paper making a soft whisper as it touched the mahogany surface. Katherine Nixon, 42, mother of 3. A photo of a smiling woman at a company picnic. Shot twice in the back as she tried to reach the emergency exit. Laquita Brown, 39, city engineer. A woman in a hard hat at a construction site. Found under her desk, still clutching her phone as she tried to call her daughter. Alexander Gusev, 31, contractor. A man holding a baby at what looked like a baptism. Killed instantly by a shot to the head. His wife was 8 months pregnant. With each name, Each photo, the silence in the room deepened. Good sat frozen in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The cameras captured every detail, the victims' faces, Good's growing discomfort, the absolute stillness of the gallery. Bobby Williams, 41, father of 2. Mary Louise Gale, 65, grandmother of 5. Ryan Keith Cox, 50, veteran and city employee. By the time Frost reached the 12th photo, tears were visible on several faces in the gallery. The photos lay spread across the table like an accusation made of flesh and memory. Mr. Good. Frost set his voice steady as granite. The man who killed these 12 people used a suppressor. He walked through their workplace like a ghost, killing them in silence. They never heard him coming. Good finally found his voice. This is emotional manipulation. These people's deaths are being exploited. These people died because someone made it easier for their killer to kill them silently. Frost's voice cut through Good's protest like a blade. And now you want to make it easier for the next one. The room erupted. Shouts from the gallery, gavels banging for order, security, moving toward potential disruptions. But through it all, the 12 photos remained spread across the table, silent witnesses to the cost of silence. When order was finally restored, the committee room felt different, charged with the kind of moral electricity that comes when political theater collides with human truth. Good sat slumped in his chair, no longer the confident defender of constitutional rights, but a man confronted with the weight of consequences he had never been forced to consider. Chairman Davis called for a brief recess, but Frost remained seated, staring at the photos spread before him. Each face told a story that would never be finished, each life cut short by technology designed to muffle the sound of murder. When the hearing resumed, Good's lawyer had clearly given him new instructions. His answers became shorter, more evasive. I don't recall. That's not my understanding. I'd have to review the documents. But Frost wasn't finished. He had one more document, one more revelation that would strip away the last pretense of noble intention. Mr. Good, in the 2022 election cycle, how much money did you receive from organizations affiliated with the firearms industry? Good's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, I'd have to check with my campaign finance team. According to Federal Election Commission filings, $47,000 in direct contributions, plus an additional $23,000 in independent expenditures. Frost held up a printout of campaign finance records. The Firearms Freedom Institute alone contributed $15,000 to your re-election campaign. Legal campaign contributions are not... Mr. Good, how much is a human life worth? The question hung in the air, like smoke from a discharged weapon. Good stared at Frost across the table, his mouth working soundlessly. How much? Frost pressed. Because according to these documents, you received $70,000 from the gun lobby, and in return, you help them deregulate devices that make it easier to commit mass murder. So I'm asking you directly, what's the going rate for making it easier to kill people in silence? I object to the characterization. 12 people are dead in Virginia Beach. Frost's voice rose to fill the chamber. They died without warning because their killer used a suppressor. And you took money from the people who make those suppressors, then help them avoid federal oversight. So tell me, Mr. Good, tell these families, tell the American people who paid you to silence America. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of truth too large and terrible to be spoken. Good sat frozen, his face cycling through expressions like a man drowning in public view. The cameras captured every moment, every micro expression of a politician realizing that his political calculation had just become a moral reckoning. In the gallery, family members of the Virginia Beach victims held each other as tears fell freely. The journalists had stopped typing, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond the normal parameters of political theater, a moment when the machinery of democracy was forced to confront the human cost of its compromises. Finally, Good leaned forward to his microphone. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never intended for anyone to get hurt. But they did get hurt, Frost replied softly. They got killed. In silence. The hearing ended without resolution, as most congressional hearings do. Good would face no criminal charges. His actions, while morally questionable, were technically legal within the labyrinthine rules that governed legislative procedure. The silencer deregulation clause would eventually be removed from the budget bill, but only after weeks of public pressure and media attention. But something had changed in that committee room, something that couldn't be measured in vote counts or policy outcomes. The families of the Virginia Beach victims had seen their loved ones' deaths acknowledged as more than statistics. A congressman had been forced to confront the human cost of his political calculations, and the American people had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of how their laws were made, in shadows and silence, with the sound of gunfire muffled by money and influence. As Frost packed up his documents, carefully placing the 12 photos back in their folder, he thought about the question he had asked: who paid you to silence America? The answer, he realized, was not just Bob Good or the gun lobby, or even the shadowy web of influence that connected K Street to Capitol Hill. The answer was a system that had learned to kill quietly, to make policy in darkness, to muffle the sound of democracy dying by degrees. The real silencer wasn't a piece of metal screwed onto the end of a gun barrel. It was the silence of citizens who had forgotten that their voices were supposed to matter. The silence of representatives who had forgotten that they were supposed to represent. But in that committee room, surrounded by the faces of the dead and the living, the silence had been broken. 12 people had found their voices again, speaking through the young congressman who refused to let their deaths be whispered away in the margins of a budget bill. Outside the Capitol, the October sun was setting behind the Washington Monument, casting long shadows across the National Mall. Somewhere in those shadows, other deals were being made, other clauses being written, other silencers being attached to the machinery of democracy. But Maxwell Frost walked through those shadows carrying 12 photos and one unshakable truth: in a democracy, silence is not golden, it's deadly. And sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to make sure their killers and those who enable them can never kill in silence again. The question lingered in the air, like the echo of gunfire. Who paid you to silence America? The answer, Frost knew, was written in blood and hidden in budget bills, whispered in committee rooms at 2 a.m., and counted in campaign contributions that turned silence into a commodity to be bought and sold. But now, at least the silence had been broken. Now at least someone was listening.